Welcome to part 3 of the portrait painting course. This one is going to be regarding the specific material properties that you're going to be encountering within any material in a portrait. So I'm not specifically going to be covering the fundamentals of what each material property is or how it functions, because there's a course on that, and I've also done a course on painting skin as well. So I'm going to cover a bit of what I have there. Really just focus in on what are the characteristics that you ought to pay attention to make a given material look like it's supposed to, look believable. I'm not going to be talking about specifically how to create reflectivity, but more so about the amount of reflectivity, for example, that a material has. And starting off, obviously, I'm going to talk about skin first, because you're going to have most of the portrait skin is going to be skin. So one big thing that I want to cover for a start is the subsurface scattering quality of skin. And subsurface scattering really is just light coming into an object, hitting it, a part of that light entering the object, and then bouncing inside, coming out, with that creating this sort of a glow effect. Now, when talking about subsurface scattering, it happens all throughout, and I think you can see that very nicely in here, how a lot of the skin tones are very warm, especially in the shadows, and I'll talk a bit about why that is. But they become warmer with subsurface scattering as compared to with subsurface scattering off. What happens mechanically is that the light will come into the object, it will bounce around the blood that is underneath the skin, and it will come out a lot more saturated and warmer. And if you look at this specific example, you can see a very saturated halftone. And now the reason why the saturation will tend to happen either in the halftone or with a rim light is because in order to see this light coming out of the surface of the material needs to be at least somewhat in shadow. And that's why, for example, in here you can see this red really strongly, because there's no other light source coming in and blowing that color out. And in this case as well, like you wouldn't, if you had a rim light on this side, you wouldn't really see this red, because there's a stronger light source from the front here. And that is an important thing to think about, is you will see a lot of subsurface scattering with rim lights. And then a very similar principle applies with halftones, is as you get into shadow, there's actual space to see the saturated light coming out. In here, the light is really being drowned out by the main matte rendering and then the specular here. But in the shadows, you can see and imagine how some of the particles might be bouncing in and really coming out right at the edge. And in the shadow itself, there's actually no light to bounce around. It stands to reason why the lightest or the most saturated portion, the portion that has most of this subsurface scattering in a direct light source, would be the halftone in there. Although, as you can see, it does happen throughout, and it really warms the whole material, so that it's really a big portion of what gives a lifelike quality, like an organic quality to the skin. Apart from having the variations that we talked about in the previous lesson, this is a very big thing. So that is one quality to watch out for, subsurface scattering. Specifically, also think about how it happens all throughout, not necessarily only with the rim light, although this is the case where you will see it most clearly and most strongly. But another quality that is often overlooked is the reflectivity that is inherent in the skin material. There is a bit of, or actually quite a bit of variation based on the quality of the skin. So if the skin is oily, or if it has something like makeup on top of it that is very greasy or oily, you will have these very strong and also pretty tight, so with pretty strong edges, speculars. And if there's actual like oil or water, the speculars will become even tighter and even more contrasty. But in a lot of cases, generally what you will get is something that is more diffuse like this, and more softer, less contrasty. That is one thing regarding the speculars. And then also you will see, just to recap, I've talked about subsurface scattering, I've talked about reflectivity, but then also within both of these characteristics, sort of, you will see the skin texture, which is going to be important only if you get into very specific rendering and getting into smaller details. But most of the texture really will be seen in the halftone, which is something that I've talked about before in some material classrooms. And that is because the light will, as it comes in here, it will hit this at a more perpendicular angle. But as it nears the terminator, it will be more tangential. So you can imagine if you had smaller forms here, they would start casting shadows. And that's a very important principle overall, that your texture will show up mostly in the terminator. So that is one place that you will see the skin texture, but also in the actual shape of the specular reflection, you will see the pores and the specific sort of pore shape or edge to the specular. So you can see that pretty strongly there. And if you analyze this, for example, specifically the highlights are really where you see the texture. You don't really see it here in the halftones, in the transitions, and places like that, and in here as well. This is really where you get a lot of that texture. So that's something to watch out for. Subsurface scattering, reflectivity based on oiliness, and also the overall texture that the skin has. And then moving on, we have the lips, which, as I've already talked about, will tend to get more warm and dark, but they will also tend to be more wet because you have the mouth there. And with that, the wetness will create a stronger specularity. And something to keep in mind with specularity, or the shape of the specular reflections, is that you have texture going across the lips that will create dents in the actual shape, and it will also generally cause the shape to become a little bit broader. And I'll talk about this effect more specifically and broadly when I get into the hair. But this is something to keep in mind, is that if you get a reflection in the lips, it will generally not be like a tight round shape, but more so a broad flatter shape like this. And also just consider how wet or glossy the lips actually are. So if there's like a lip gloss, they will become a lot more reflective. The reflection, or the specular reflection, will have a lot of a more strong edge, a harder edge, and it will be more contrasty. And in this example, you can see that even though there is a reflection there, it's much more soft and less contrasty. So there is quite a bit of variation, but this texture is what happens regardless. So that would be the lips. And then going into the eyes, there's actually quite a bit to talk about here. Specifically, let's start off with just the actual form of the eye and how that impacts the way you would render it. First of all, there is quite a bit of thickness to the lids, and often they could catch highlights at the break of the top and the front plane. And also, because of the eye constantly being moisturized, the lids will also often be more wet, so that they will actually be more prone to catching those highlights. That is one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is that this lid overhangs above the eye. It has a bit of thickness, and it will often cast a shadow, as you can see here. And that shadow might be very soft, or an occlusion shadow, but it will be there. So often there will be a shadow being cast on the eyeball itself. And also, in many cases, you will see a form shadow on the eyeball. So if you imagine the eyeball like this, inside of the actual orbit there, it can have, and it often does, depending on the light source, of course, but it often does have a strong form shadow that looks something like this. So there is a distinction between a shadow and a light value, and you can see that very clearly in here. And another thing to consider regarding the outer appearance of the eye is that this eyeball is not going to appear as completely white. It will actually be like a value 2 or something like that. Here it's a bit lighter, perhaps because of some reflections, and also obviously depending on the photography, but it will not be completely white. And if you make it completely white, you will lose a space to have a specular reflection, because if the local value is completely white, then there's no contrast to be had for a white reflection. So that is something that is important to keep in mind. This is really everything regarding the outer appearance. And then on the qualities of the eyeball itself, it is very glossy. As I've already mentioned, it does have a matte rendering to it. So it's not completely like metallic, but it is very, very glossy. And so you will almost always get a tight specular in some place. This form here, I think this is the pupil. This whole form is actually concave, or it's convex. It bulges out. If you look at the cross section, it might look something like this, and that is important because that's gonna change up the placement of the highlight somewhat, and that also you might get a highlight in between this bulging and the actual eyeball. That is just something to consider. But more broadly and more importantly, there will, in most cases, be specular highlights that are very contrasty and that also show and reflect the shape of the light source. So you see that there's like a window light in here, and this looks like a door. So it reflects the light source very, very strongly and very clearly. And another point that is important and often overlooked is that the edge between the colored part of the eye and the eyeball, the white of the eye, is not sharp. It's actually pretty fuzzy. So when you, and if you get into rendering very specific details, you can soften this edge, and that's going to give a more believable appearance. So I think that's really covering everything regarding the eyes. One thing that you will also notice that I've kind of mentioned throughout in some other courses or other classrooms regarding materials is that because of the value of the white of the eye, it being very light, these reflections will often visually appear weaker, and you will actually have the strongest contrast right here where the value is a lot darker. So that's something to consider and keep in mind as well. Now I want to get into here and to point you towards a classroom that I have on painting animal textures. And specifically, I think this is a really good example of that. When the hair is short, it really acts a lot like fur, and it actually kind of is fur. So it does clump, and it has these occlusion shadows. And that's some material that I've talked about in that classroom. So you can look at that. And I think this is a really good example of that because you can actually see sort of, because the tips are frosted and there's a gradient, you can see how the clumps look more clearly. And this is something that's very helpful to think about. Think about the masses being grouped in clumps, and then the clumps overlapping, and then between the clumps there being deeper occlusion shadows. And then another note that I've also touched on in the animal painting course, or the animal textures painting course, is that if you have, let's say this is the skull here, and if you have the hair growing out like this, and you look into it, you will see most of the occlusion shadows. So these deep parts, these deep shadows, you will see most of them in between the clumps. But as your eye line becomes more tangential to the form, you can see how it doesn't actually reach into the deep crevices. So this is also something that's very helpful when describing form and showing this depth in hair textures of any kind, like fur or short hair, really doesn't matter. And then obviously like the brows and the eyelashes are also here, and visually the eyebrows will look pretty soft because there's a bunch of hairs there. They're not completely there's not a complete edge, like a strong sharp edge to them, and so they will be fairly soft visually around the edges. And then the hairline itself also will not just abruptly cut out, but there will also be a gradient visually. If you look at it from afar, it's a lot softer than you might think without considering this. Really, there's quite a bit of similarity between the brows, and if you like buzz your hair. So that is really the most important principle that I would watch out and think about when doing short hair, especially if it's less straight, more messy like this. But then if you get into longer hair and even shorter hair, there's combed and straight, you run into a specific effect that happens with things that have a straight texture going across them, and it's called anisotropic reflection. And what it is in essence is, if you have a texture that is a bunch of straight lines going this way, your reflection will spread in the perpendicular direction. So the texture spreads this way, and you can see that very, very clearly in these balls. And you can also see how much they resemble hair. And in this example, the texture is round, so it's a little bit of a different thing. But this is also an example of that reflection. But I think this is really the best example there is, apart from actually looking at literal hair. So let's do that. And if you look at the hair, you can see that same effect taking place. So if you imagine that this is just a sphere, because it really is sort of a sphere without any texture on top of it, you can see how logically you would think that the reflection would be round. But since there is that, in this case, just texture created by hair, the reflection spreads out very widely across here. And you can see that a little bit less clearly, or at least more short shapes around the long parts here, but in the bangs here it's very, very obvious and very clear. And in this case as well, although it's a little bit more spread out because the hair has a rougher texture, it's less slick. You can still see a very broad shape there. Really, really spreads out. So that's very important to look out for. And I think that is really the key to rendering hair, is that obviously it's reflective, but the way it reflects is very specific. So you might get this strong spread out reflection of the light source, a strong specular, more contrasty, and then get some field reflections up here. So in here, for example, and maybe some secondary ones. But it's really important to focus in on the anisotropic effect that happens there. And then finally, I also just want to touch on beards. Specifically, this can apply to hair as well, but the different quality of hair and how it renders differently, or how it visually looks different. It has different material qualities. So if you look at this beard here, it really doesn't have the same specularity because the texture is a lot rougher, and the specular is really spread out. It's not really a shape at all. It's just like a gradient. You can imagine how if it was this slick and straight, the reflection would look a lot more like perhaps something here. Let's mock it up. It might look a lot more like that, I guess. Maybe a little bit less saturated. So maybe something like that, and maybe it would have a softer edge. But this is what it might look like if it was a lot smoother. But since it's not, there's just a very spread out reflection there, and you can actually see an example with the hair being straighter, and even though it's a lot more rough, it does have, again, that same pattern of specular reflection that we see in actual head hair. So when thinking about the materials, or specifically when thinking about hair, it's important to also consider the different qualities within hair, a spectrum of roughness and sleekness, and also just different qualities in terms of straightness versus a more curved look. And with straightness, you will get most of this reflectivity. With something that's more curved or wavy, you will get shorter reflections like that. But I thought that that's something that would be interesting to point out. And also, a lot of this quality, especially in here, a lot of material quality can be achieved through edges. So I thought it's also important to point out that if you make your hair silhouettes too hard and pixel perfect, they will look like wigs, and they will not look organic, because hair is soft. It's soft to touch, and specifically things like this have a very soft edge. If you look at them from afar, visually, that's a very soft edge, and even hair that's sleek like this has an edge that's way softer than you might expect, and that kind of echoes in the edge between the hairline and the skin. But I thought that's something that could be interesting to point out, is that with all of these materials, really, you should try to avoid completely hard edges because they're organic, and you can just think about the softness of each material. Like skin and flesh is soft to the touch, and hair is also soft. So then it stands to reason that you would create softer edges to sort of echo that quality in painting. And just as a final note on skin, if you want to do scars, and this is somewhat gruesome, so it's a bit of a content warning, but with scars, often what happens, apart from the obvious color changes, that they will become more reflective for some reason. So whether it's this sort of a thick scar tissue or a thinner, lighter scar, a lot of times you will see more reflectivity in the scar as compared to the rest of the skin around it. So if you want to do like cool scars and characters and stuff like that, you can consider making them a little bit more reflective, and I think that will add a layer of believability to the materials. Alright, so for the assignment for lesson 3, you're going to be doing really material studies. You're going to do 3 studies of hair, 2 studies of different types of skin, whether that be a different color and different glossiness. It would preferably be both. And then also 2 studies of eyes/eyeballs and 2 studies of lips. Now with hair, what I would want you to do is to have a separate drawing or like a very quick painting of like a mannequin that you would place your hair on top of, and then the hair would be a separate thing, and this is really where you would render and study the material properties. And this is just a placeholder, so you draw the positioning of the hair, and you also have some construction to work with. And then obviously you would also put in a bit of work with some transitions at the hairline as well, so you need a base color of skin to get those too. So that's the way that I would approach your hair study. So if you get a different type of hair. Preferably, it would be like vastly different types of hair, like curly hair, straight hair, long hair, very different both types and styles. And maybe you can have one or two that have beards as well, maybe just one, and that would help also. Now, in this case, since I have a separate layer for the hair, I could use that as well for, placing in the facial hair as well. And if you finish one, you can do another one on your same mannequin. If you have a different angle, you can sort of invent the hair a little bit, or you can do a separate mannequin altogether, and these can be done very quickly. So you don't have to put in any sort of detail or work really into this base other than just a fundamental construction so you can place the hair on top of. And when talking about the skin renderings, it's really going to be more about the actual portrait. So if I was doing this as a skin render, then I would not worry about too much about hair or anything like that, and just focusing on finding a reference that specifically works well for studying the properties of skin that I talked about. So like subsurface scattering, and that's to do with the situation of lighting, and then also obviously the transitions and the local color changes. But I would find separate reference images for everything, because a reference image that's good for hair might not be perfect for skin. So I would do those separately. And when I do like a painting of skin, I might also block in obviously the hair, but I would focus in on rendering the skin and analyzing the skin really carefully. Do two studies of that, and with that you will have the ability to select something vastly different for the two paintings and study different scenarios. And for the eyeballs or the eyes and the lips, I would obviously not paint the whole head, but I would try to get a drawing or a reference that has some context to start off with. And then when I draw that reference, for example, if I'm doing an eye, I wouldn't just have an eye floating in here. I would have the whole construction, like the orbit, the eye bag, some of the cheek, perhaps even where the nose connects. So I have some context to place that eye within. So it's not just a floating eye. So that I'm not only doing something that's disconnected like this, but that has that's rooted in the whole face. And the same idea with the mouth as well. If I do some lips like this, and I would want to have the rough positioning of the chin, the philtrum, and how that connects to the nose, even though I wouldn't go in and render the nose necessarily. I would focus in my rendering on this area, but I might block in some of the colors in here, again, just to have the context figured out, and so it's not just a floating mouth. And I would do two separate studies for each of these, so maybe select a different lighting scenario, a different color for the eyes, and then for the lips, perhaps a different skin color and a different glossiness to the lips. So maybe like male and female lips would work well, just to get some variety in there. But that's really about it. Good luck and have fun.